Modern Era from 1750 to 1900. During this time, Spain and Portugal continued to dominate in Latin America, but some of their former colonies started to revolt as well. Haiti, Mexico, and some South American countries decided to kick out these foreign imperialists and start their own independence movements for their own countries that still exist today. In Europe, once again, Europe was divided into the western and eastern half. Western European countries continue to grow, and many of the countries that grew during this time are still ones that we see as powerhouses today in the world economy. Russia was the main player in the East. They were really big, and so they absorbed most of the other smaller countries in Eastern Europe at the time. In Africa, European colonies continued to dominate. African kingdoms were really weak compared to the Europeans and thus didn't have much power in the grand scheme of things. Internally, there were many reasons for fall for Latin America. So revolutions by the Creoles and indigenous people. These were people who were usually of mixed European and native descent, and regular indigenous people wanted to kick out these governments that were established by Spain and Portugal, and they were successful in doing so, leading to independence. Externally, there was wars and disputes in Europe that took greater emphasis than all these small skirmishes in Latin America, and so that's how the European powers in Latin America fell during this time as well. In Europe, it did not fall, of course, because Europe still continues on to the next time period, but there were four main factors that contributed to a weakening of Europe, and these were militarism, the excessive buildup of military, alliances between different countries, imperialism, imperializing different countries on other continents for resources, and also nationalism, intense pride for one's nation. These four are known as main, and they're the main reason for World War I, which would eventually happen in the next period. Also during this time, a big note is that the Industrial Revolution began during this time. The first Industrial Revolution began, and with this, a bunch of new technology and the greater rise of cities around the world. Also, these are also where these imperial powers originate. Europe was mainly the hotbed of all this imperialistic activity. They were the center, and they controlled most of the mercantilism and imperialism going on around the world. In Africa, internally there were ethnic disputes. This didn't help indigenous Africans try to fight off the Europeans. And externally, the European colonizers decided to completely take over Africa. They thought it was legal, and through the Berlin Conference and Scramble for Africa, they partitioned Africa into different colonies where each European nation basically got a whole bit of Africa. This was at the Berlin Conference, of course, and basically one of the only last kingdoms to stand was the Congo African Kingdom. But pretty soon after, Europeans were able to capture most of Africa and control all of Africa until after World War II. In Latin America, this was a time characterized by wars. There were many wars, for example, the Mexican-American War in the mid-1800s, where Mexico fought the United States over the land of Texas. Also, a Mexican Revolution, where they overthrew dictators and military leaders named caudillos. And also a Spanish-American War, where America, the United States, wanted to expel Spain from colonies in the Americas, such as the island of Cuba. And eventually America won this short, quick war again and became the main dominating force in the Western Hemisphere. America basically became a European imperializer. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire continued to dominate during this time, while in South Asia, the Indians succumbed to the British. The British were imperializing heavily in India, and they were able to take control of the Indians because the Indians were decentralized again, so they didn't have much power. In East Asia, China was going into its last dynasty, the Qing dynasty, while in Japan, the Meiji Restoration occurred, where the Meiji tried to restore some good parts of the Tokugawa shogunate, but they weren't always successful, and Vietnam, or Indochina, started to rise during this time as well, just south of China in the Qing dynasty. Eventually, the Middle East started to fall, and it was because of the Young Turks, who were a new group of Muslims who were trying to change how things were being ruled in Turkey and the surrounding area, and also a weakening economy. The Middle East was traditionally the trade center, but during this time, trade was able to go through different areas, such as waterways that were not controlled by the Ottomans, and so they lost trade revenue. Also, foreign investment from European powers really started to come in and break up parts of the Ottoman Empire, and the government was becoming more and more weak because they were basically selling all their power to the European economic powerhouses. The British would continue to rule India for a long period until after World War II. The Indian National Congress was a group of intellectuals who wanted self-rule, but they weren't always successful at first. In China, internal revolts such as the Boxer Rebellion and other revolutions started to bring down this last dynasty, and there were also pressures from spheres of influence. These were foreign powers, usually from countries such as Europe, but also included the United States, who tried to come into China and control much of the trade, because China was still a hotbed for trade during this time. And for Vietnam, they soon succumbed to the French. It became a French colony and wouldn't be able to gain independence until after the Vietnam War. They became known as French Indochina, so that's a good name to know. The Ottoman Empire continued to be basically the sole remaining gunpowder empire because India was falling rapidly at this time. And the Opium Wars, also an important note in world history. The British tried to import lots of opium into China, into the ports in Canton, while the Chinese tried to stop it, and the British didn't want to stop this trade because, of course, opium is addictive and also very profitable, and thus a war ensued, but the Chinese got defeated quickly. Also, a Russo-Japanese war came during this time. It really showed off Japan's ability to fight war against a big country such as Russia, and showed Japan's rising prominence in this area of the world during this time. So Unit 5, it was known as the modern time period from 1750 to 1900. This time period was really characterized by revolutions, especially in Latin America. These independence movements really utilized Enlightenment ideals, which was also a new type of thinking during this time, where people advocated for natural rights. Famous thinkers include like Voltaire and John Locke and others, who really tried to focus on people having individual rights, not that absolute monarchy that had come before. This is also the basically blooming of the age of imperialism and colonization. This would definitely be a high point, and it was also a high point for industrialization, where European cities really grew to become industrial centers of the world, even to today. On the other side of this, however, weaker countries such as the Ottoman Empire had to give capitulations to European superpowers, and they also had to give rights of extraterritoriality, basically granting European countries an exemption from certain trade laws, because of course Europeans had lots of influence during this time in all the trade, and as a result this helped to bring down the weaker nations. At the end of this, the Europeans became the main dominating force moving forward in history. Contemporary period from 1900 to present. In Latin America during this time, Spain and Portugal continued to be the colonizers, but many Latin American countries started to have their own independence movements, and soon these two countries had less influence in this part of the Western Hemisphere. In Europe, there was still a big western part of Europe and an eastern part of Europe. Western European countries continued from the last period, such as Germany, France, and Great Britain, while in the eastern part, the Soviet Union rose in 1917. In the Russian Revolution, they took over most of Russia and many other states along Eastern Europe, and they eventually fell, though, at the end in 1990 when the Cold War came to an end. In Africa, European colonies continued to be prevalent until World War II. After World War II, many African countries gained their own sovereignty and their own rights to start forming countries, kind of like we have today. So there's a map of everything. As you can see, the Soviet Union basically took over all of Eastern Europe and secluded itself from most of Western Europe. While many of these areas still exist today, in Latin America, the countries formed after the Spanish and Portuguese finally left. In Europe, most of these countries have remained pretty stable. However, in the Soviet Union, they eventually fell because of political and economic hardships. Communism wasn't working out. And externally, there was political pressure from foreign countries who wanted the Soviet Union to break up, and eventually it did, into Russia and other states. In Africa, following World War II, Many European countries decided to leave because they faced their own problems back at home, and in other cases, African independence movements grew really large during this time as well and overthrew the last European countries who had controlled Africa. During this time, the Soviet Union had drastically tried to impress communism on certain South American countries, and many South American countries had these leftist revolts, although most weren't successful. The notable exception, of course, is Cuba, and Cuba was really close to America, and that caused some tensions between democracy and communism. Also, during this time, World War I and World War II both occurred. It started in Europe and eventually, of course, spread to the rest of the world. And eventually, with the fall of the Soviet Union, East and West Germany, which were previously divided after World War II, were able to be reunited when the Berlin Wall was torn down. Also, different states in the Balkans, which is sort of like Southeast Asia, started to have more power as well. Eventually, the age of imperialism, as mentioned, had ended in Africa. Apartheid was still prevalent, though, in places such as South Africa, where segregation was a big law of the land, but eventually the African National Congress helped to push away this segregation and enable more Africans to freedom. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire eventually fell after World War I, and modern Middle Eastern countries started to form, kind of like in the past, and they still exist today. In South Asia, Britain faced off with the Indian National Congress. India was a colony of Britain during this time. Eventually, the Indian National Congress won out, and the British left India, much like they had left other colonies around the world. And with that, India had this new big amount of land. Eventually, though, there were divisive groups, such as the Pakistanis, who are majority Muslim, and they wanted to break away from India, and so Pakistan formed to the left of India, while in Bangladesh, there was a separate movement where Bangladesh was formed. In East Asia, after the Japanese were defeated after World War II, previous countries that were once under Japanese rule started to rise again. The modern nation of China rose during this time after the 1949 Communist Revolution. Japan was under American rule sort of for a few years following World War II, but eventually they were able to gain their own government back again. And in Vietnam, forces were able to successfully free previous captors from the Japanese, and they were able to start up Southeast Asia again to really start growing that part of the world. Korea, however, was split. So North and South Korea were split after the war, and eventually they would fight a Korean War to try to solve the issue of reunification. Ultimately, it did not succeed, and North and South Korea, of course, are still split today. There's much instability in the Middle East following World War II. First, there was the creation of Israel in 1948. This angered many of the Arab and Muslim nations who didn't really like Jews, and also the taking of land away from Palestine. There was also the 1979 Iranian Revolution, where the Shah that was instituted by the United States was overthrown. There was the first Gulf War in the 1990s when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and international forces came together to try to push out Iraq. There was 9/11, a big terrorist attack in New York City, Washington, D.C., and elsewhere in the United States. And of course, this started a whole war on terrorism that will continue to today. There's also the second Gulf War, the Iraq War, where Americans and other forces thought the leader of Iraq at the time, Saddam Hussein, had weapons of mass destruction and also was harboring terrorists, so they came in and tried to dispose of him. In South Asia, British imperialism ended, and East Pakistan formally became Bangladesh. These countries also exhibited the non-alignment movement, which was, in the context of the Cold War, called for countries not to ally with the Soviet Union or the United States, so to play neutral. In China, the 1949 revolution, of course, kicked the Chinese nationalists out onto the island of Taiwan. And North and South Korea, they split after World War II, and also in an attempt for reunification that was not successful, they maintained their separate countries. North Korea today is communist, totalitarian, and pretty isolationist compared to the rest of the world, while South Korea is a strong Asian economy and is very similar to many other Western nations in that it's capitalist, democratic, and participates heavily in world trade. During this time, we see lots of change. There is new migration and labor practices that have gone on around the world. More people are moving to the industrialized nations, so Western Europe and also the United States, because of the job opportunities there. Also, demographics are changing, so as people migrate, they significantly alter the race buildup and ethnicity makeup of a certain country. That's very prevalent as seen in the United States. The environment has changed a lot as well. So, following all this industrialization, there have been concerns over climate change and global warming, and a new environmental movement has risen as well. Beliefs and ideas have continued to shape and evolve as they always do in history, religion, and philosophy. Many of the old religions, such as Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and Hinduism, they still exist, but many of them have undergone more changes as people progress in history. Art and culture scenes have also changed. There's this more liberalization of art and new different styles that have risen away from the things that used to come. So in the 1900s, basically, it started with a relative time of peace. Then it progressed to World War I and World War II. Then a battle between different new types of political ideologies such as communism, socialism, and fascism. Communism is like government control of everything. Socialism is like a smaller form of communism where wealth is distributed based on need. And then fascism is like totalitarianism and one leader in charge. It's very important not to get confused between communism and fascism because people like to test those kind of concepts. Fascism, most notably, was Hitler and also Mussolini in Italy. Globalization has really occurred during this time as technology has improved and people are more connected. But in the 60s, feminism and civil rights really grew as well as people gained more rights during that time period, as they still are shooting for today. Many people still feel their civil rights are not properly taken care of, and women continue to fight for freedoms and from discrimination in places such as the workplace. Nationalism has also been strong in many countries where people adhere more and more closely to their country. This is good because it's patriotic, but sometimes it can also have issues, especially if a foreign country does something wrong. Decolonization was the main theme of this time. In places such as South Asia and Africa and Latin America, former colonies became decentralized and new countries were able to form. Technology has really revolutionized how people communicate, as mentioned previously, and accelerated the rate of globalization. This makes people even more interconnected for the future and is really going to shape how people work in the future. Well, this has been AP World History Exam Cram on Alex Academy. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure to check out my 5 tips to ace the AP World History exam if you haven't already seen it, and hope you do well on your exam.